Okay, so time to confess. I don't know if it's a good or a bad thing to be putting this out on YouTube. Today I'm talking lessons learned and mistakes I've made in my first couple of years as a knitting and crochet pattern designer. This is perfect for anyone who's new to pattern designing or thinking about or in the process of writing their first pattern. As someone who's only been doing it for a couple of years with still lots to learn, this one is for you. If you're new here and watching for the first time, my name's Emma of Wander and Create with Emma. I'm an avid knitter and crocheter, and I have been doing that as a hobby for over 10 years and then starting to design patterns in the last 2 years. On my YouTube channel, I have kind of vlog style episodes where I'll show you what I've been working on, like either designing or just making patterns from other designers. If I've traveled anywhere interesting, I kind of take you with me as well. But I also like to do these kind of more information style videos where I share any tips I may have, or I share lessons learned like this one, because I really love to have that shared knowledge that in this community of knitters and crocheters. So if you enjoy this style of content, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up. So if you're a regular to this channel, you'll know that a few videos ago I did publish a video that was all about the resources that I found useful as a newbie pattern designer. So by resources I mean like websites and people and books, etc. So you might want to go back and check that out. If you haven't watched it already, you can watch it after this video. It doesn't matter the order. But yeah, it's really helpful list of things there that I've used and continue to use in my journey into pattern designing. Okay, so time to confess. I don't know if it's a good or a bad thing to be putting this out on YouTube as someone that would love it if people were continuing to buy my patterns. I will say, although I have made a lot of mistakes and learned a lot of things, the end product, the end pattern, I'm always really proud of because I have put the work in and I've worked with tech editors and pattern testers. So I'm really confident in the quality of the end result, but I might make a lot of mistakes along the way. And I'm going to share them with you because then maybe you don't need to make them. Okay, so here we go. I haven't really got a proper structure to this. I've kind of picked some topic sections in pattern designing where I have particularly made like repeated mistakes or it took me a while to kind of get into the habit of doing something. So I'll try and break it down like that. But we might go off on tangents, we'll see. To start with, I want to talk about gauge. I know this is always a hotly debated topic in general with knitting and crocheters about the need to do a gauge swatch or not. Personally, sorry to say, I'm a big lover of the gauge swatch. It might not be a popular opinion, but I think it's really important to take the time to make the swatch so you know that it's going to be, the end result is going to be exactly the size you want it, the kind of drape that you might want it if it's a like loose pattern. It just gives you the opportunity to change needle sizes if you want, or you know, if you're that way inclined, you can know like, okay, my swatch doesn't meet the designers, but therefore I'll pick this size and I'll end up with the same result, that kind of thing. It's just that first piece of giving you the information you need to then go on and edit the project. I know it takes time. I also hate, you know, doing that process, waiting, washing and blocking it, waiting for it to dry, because I just want to get going. I totally understand that feeling. But it's important, and it's even more important when you're designing patterns. Like, you really have to make that gauge swatch to then inform you when you're making that first sample, when you're grading the patterns. That gauge swatch is going to be vital to tell you everything that you need to know. And even more so for designing, if you have a pattern that's going to have kind of different stitch patterns. For example, the Hornby vest that I'm wearing now, I obviously have like ribbing around the arms, the neck and the bottom, and then I have the half double crochet stitch that I use for the rest of the body. So when I was designing this vest, I needed to do 2 gauge swatches, like one for the ribbing, one for the half double crochet, and then like the downtown socks that are coming out soon are currently in testing. That has a twisted rib stitch for the cuff, it has just stockinette stitch, and then it has some colour work to it. So that was 3 gauge swatches that I needed to do in order to get the measurements as accurate as I could across the whole sock, with all the different stitching. So I've come up against this quite a lot where I've had an idea in my head and I've made it. I'm really happy with my sample, but then it comes to grading it to other sizes and I feel like the stitch count doesn't quite work, and it means that for other sizes I won't be able to get the consistent repeats. For example, my Nelson top that has a kind of heart, it's a crochet top and it has heart cutouts, like a mesh style design. So when I initially made that sample, The hearts were a little bigger and a little more spaced out. I was really happy with it in the sample. I'd made it work for my measurements, like based on the Craft Yarn Council, which I mentioned as a resource in my previous video. The measurements that I fit on the Craft Yarn Council, I'd made it work for that size. But then when it came to grading to smaller and bigger sizes, it wasn't working, and I wasn't going to get that consistent heart repeat. It was going to end up kind of with sections that on the seam or something of each panel that would be narrower, and it just wouldn't look as consistent. And I really fought against trying to figure it out for a while and thought, oh, I'm sure that's fine, it doesn't matter if some sections are narrower than others. But then just had a word with myself and was like, just put the effort in to make it, figure out a way to make it consistent. So I played around with it quite a bit. There was lots of frogging involved, but then I got to the point where I figured out how to place the hearts at a certain width apart. I changed the width of the heart itself, so I made it slightly narrower than I had originally made it, and I got to a place where I could grade it. And again, that's just something to consider at the gauge swatch stage. So I hadn't really thought about it at the gauge swatch stage. I'd made the gauge, I was like, oh, that looks great. I've got the measurements, so I know what I need to do to make my size, and it just happened to work for my size at that in that initial stage, initial design. But if you were to properly think about it, if I had at the gauge swatch stage got the measurements of the stitch repeat and then thought about, okay, how will it work for this size, how will it work for that size, because it tends to only be like 1 inch, 2 inch between the design. So if you have you know, 8 stitches to 1 inch, for example, but your stitch repeat is 6, then you're going to end up with a couple of stitches each inch that is, and over the course of the garment, if it's a top, if it's socks, whatever it may be, it's going to end up, you're going to run into some difficulties there in making it look consistent. I actually have the perfect example of this with the downtown sock. So this is the sock that is coming out in just over a week now. So this is the sample that I made initially after doing my gauge, where again I didn't kind of factor in all sizes when I made my gauge. And you'll see that it's a 3-stitch pattern repeat, or the colour work is like 3 different stripes going round. And so it's kind of a 6-stitch pattern repeat basically, if you know, go blue, in this case blue, yellow, blue, yellow, blue, yellow, to do the 3 different heights of stripes. And that works out in this pattern to be like 0.75 of an inch, where actually if you look at Craft Yarn Council for their foot circumference measurements, there's kind of 1 inch between sizes. So then when I came to writing the pattern, I knew that this wasn't going to work, because you wouldn't have that 3 consistent all the way around and still fit. And even though I'd learned this lesson before with my Nelson top, I still found myself thinking, oh, well, maybe I can just have it be an extra couple of stitches, and maybe it'll be slightly bigger than normal, but I'm sure it wouldn't be too baggy, it'll be fine. Because I just liked the look of this. And then after, you know, just a little bit of time, it kind of dawned on me that all I really have to do is add 2 more stitches to get it to 8-stitch pattern repeat, which would then be 1 inch, and therefore sorted. Easy grading. So the final one, you'll see it has a 4-stitch repeat. So I just added a slightly higher stripe in. And it still looks great. It still has the effect I wanted of looking like a skyline, and all I had to do was add a couple of extra stitches into the pattern repeat. It then is a 1 inch pattern repeat. Easy. Obviously, if I'd taken the time to think about that at the gauge swatch stage, it would have saved me a lot of time. This sock fits me, but I only made 1 before I started writing the pattern, and now I'm like, there's no point in doing it again. But I will make another one of these, but I'll just do it with the 8-stitch pattern repeat. I've also come to realise that this kind of applies when you're following patterns, but when you're designing patterns, you know, the measurements tend to go off a 4x4 inch, 10x10 centimetre square of stitches, but I think when you're designing in particular, going bigger than that is really helpful, because you might change your tension and stuff across a bigger swatch. So I have started to do that kind of maybe 6x6 or 8x8 swatch blocks, swatch squares, just to give me that real clear, definitive information that I can see across a wide range, the consistency of my stitches, and get a more accurate measurement. Also, just having that gauge swatch that's flat is much easier to measure than if you just winged it, made a sock. Trying to use like that finished socks that has a small circumference and isn't particularly straight in some sections, it's going to be much harder to measure when you're grading to all the other sizes compared to like something flat that you can lay down and just measure with a straight ruler. It's going to be something that you continuously go back to when you're, making your sample and then grading and writing the pattern as well. You're going to be continuously needing to go back to that gauge swatch to measure the rows, to measure the width, etc, etc. So in summary of that, unless you're designing something that is only one size, you don't have to worry about it. But where it's something that's going to be multiple sizes, at the gauge swatch stage, try and think if your pattern repeat is going to work across multiple sizes. Don't do me and just focus on, well, what's going to work for my size because that's a sample I'm making. Think ahead and think, is that going to work across all the other sizes that I want to grade it to? So yeah, I guess that's my number one. Gauge swatch, make it a big one because you are going to be using it all the time when it comes to writing your pattern. So it's really worth the investment of time. Next is making notes as you go. I can't tell you how frustrated I have been, always having the good intention of, as I'm making my sample, I'll write down what I did, I'll write down when I changed to the next section, when I got to this length, that kind of thing. And for some of my designs, I did not do that. And it's kind of painstaking then when you finish the sample and you're writing the pattern to go back and try and remember the decisions you made. Was that the length that you wanted? What were you thinking there? So for my last couple of patterns, I really tried to make use of jotting things down as I think of them, whether it's like the notes app on my phone or, good old trusty paper pen. I really tried to just have something near me so that as I'm doing something, I write it down. It makes it much easier when you come to write the pattern, even if the pattern was really simple and quite straightforward. It just makes it that step easier. There's not so much of a mental barrier to like, oh, now I've got to write this. If you've kind of done a lot of the hard work already, if you've written out the steps, like I got to 1 inch and then I changed to just do the next thing, and that's just super helpful. Really easy one, but again, I was getting frustrated. I mean, even though I have been better at making notes, there's still some times that I forget to do it, or I have way too much confidence in my memory, which I shouldn't have because my memory is terrible, and I'll think, oh, I won't forget that, and then of course I do. So write stuff down. Be prepared to frog. I have frogged so much, and it drives me crazy sometimes because some of it has been stupid mistakes that I have made because I just wasn't thinking. For example, again with the downtown socks, something that was driving me wild was when I was making, I'd done that first sample, realised it was wrong, started again with the new pattern stitch repeat. Yep. And it's top down, so I would be doing the cuff, and then I'd start on the colourway, and I'd get to almost the bottom of the colourway and realise that I didn't go up a needle size to do the colourway, which for this pattern, and I think in general when there's colourway involved, is kind of integral to go up a needle size just because of the tension change, and I knew I had to because otherwise it wasn't going to go around my foot to get on. And I did that a number of times, making these samples, and sometimes I'd remember to do it here, and then because I was so excited to finish the sock, I would get to the bottom of the sock, realise again halfway through that I haven't done it, and I'd have to start again. And it was driving me wild. And that can happen designing or no designing, but I was like, this is my pattern, I should be remembering that I need to do this. So I was frogging. That's maybe one of the sillier examples, but making this Hornby vest, I also did frog this a lot. Again, if you've been on this channel for a while, you'll remember that my initial idea for this vest was going to be a waffle stitch design. And this is worked bottom up, and I had got about this far in from the bottom before realising that I didn't like how it was going to look, I thought it was going to look too bulky. So I had to frog back and start again. But even then, when I was making this finished design, I frogged quite a few times because I realised I'd gone too far up on the front panel, and the neck and the shoulders, it was all too much fabric, too high on the neck. Frog back and go again. This may have been resolved if I'd done some proper measuring, I'm not sure, or this is just part of the process, but all that to say is be prepared to frog, because sometimes you can have an idea in mind, you can have designed it all out, taken measurements, but actually when it comes to making it, you decide you don't like the overall look. So just be patient, be prepared to frog. It's all part of the process, and sometimes it just has to be done, but just remember that it's always going to be worth it, because you're going to then end up with a pattern that you're really proud of, rather than something that you're like, oh, could have been better, but I didn't want to frog it and try something new. Next up in my kind of huge lessons learned is maths. Now, I have never been good with maths. My brain seems to shut down just at the idea of it. But that being said, in this design journey, I have enjoyed utilising that part of my brain again, because it does not get used very much. And in general, it's fairly straightforward math, but it's still difficult to me. And this is again another big shout out to tech editors who have helped me so much with this process, and I have learnt from them, as well as just learning as I continue to design more patterns. So when it comes to grading patterns, I do tend to get myself in a bit of a twist with how to figure out stitches and row counts across multiple sizes. But I think it's just, again, continuously checking the maths against that gauge swatch. So I guess it's not just the maths, it's everything that comes with that. And again, this is the shout out to the gauge swatch. You're going to be continuously checking back against that. For example, if you are designing a sock, there's going to be multiple pieces to factor in just to get the foot length. For example, you know, you'll have the length that you want the foot, say it's 8 inches, and you might think, okay, 8 inches is that many rows. But you've got to factor in, like, how many rows is it going to take to do the heel turn if you're doing a heel flap, and how that's going to be different from everybody depending on the size. The same with toe decreases. You know, if I think the toe decreases is going to account for 1.5 inches of the pattern, someone making a larger size is going to have more rounds of toe decreases than someone making a smaller size. If I say in the pattern to decrease until you have, for example, 8 stitches left on each needle to then graft together, someone who's making the bigger size, it might be more than 2 inches of toe decreases because they've got more rows to decrease to get there. Or maybe you then change the pattern so that someone making a larger size just needs to get down to 12 stitches on each needle. They're the kind of things to consider. Again, if this seems obvious to you, that's brilliant. To me, it wasn't. I would just say the toe decrease is going to go across 2 inches, decrease so you've got to this size, and that'll be about 2 inches. But that's obviously not the case. If I'm saying in the pattern to work the body of the foot until you get to X length, because then there's only 1.5 inches left of the total foot length, you need to consider how many rounds of decreases they're going to do, what the length of that is going to be, and then kind of that helps people know how much of the sole of the foot to work. I know quite a lot of sock patterns will just say, they might give an indication of length knit to, or they might just give a measurement of until it's kind of in line with your smallest toe, which is in general a good enough measurement, but it's handy to give some people guidance. And I think in my first draft that I sent to the editor, I hadn't factored in the rows that would be on the heel turn, so I'd kind of said, oh, knit X amount of length, but I actually hadn't factored in, can you even see this? I hadn't factored in those stitches that would be here for the heel turn, and you know, maybe that's an inch of knitting and then the body is going to be less. So there is a lot of maths to consider, and it's taken my brain a little while to get my head around it all. I still sometimes get in a bit of a twist of like, okay, well, if it's this many stitches for this, how many stitches is it for this side? How do I work that out? How many rows do they need? How do I work that out? Especially when it's Like for example, this top again, to use it as an example, the front panels, the back panel, you're going back and forth, back and forth. So there's right side of the rows and there's wrong side of the row. And so then if you're telling someone crochet, half double crochet back and forth until you get to X inches, I wasn't thinking about whether they would be finishing on the right side of the row or the wrong side of the row. But that could be really important when it comes to the next steps. As it turns out for this pattern, it wasn't important, but in some cases it might be. So again, it was then, this is sort of maths in a way, but thinking, okay, if they need to make crochet back and forth to X amount of inches, how many rows is that actually? And does that mean they're going to end on a right side or a wrong side? And then what do I need to tell them in the instructions? So there's loads and loads of tiny little things to think about that I've been learning as I go. And, you know, the tech editors were telling me at first and highlighting it, but now I'm kind of learning to identify that myself. But these are things I think are handy to know at first. Maybe I just didn't do a deep dive enough, or maybe it's just all part of the process, but now I get it. And I think that kind of leads me on to my final piece, which is consistency in style when writing your patterns. So it's always recommended to have a style sheet, and I know that I want to have one, I just haven't bothered putting the time in. But now I've done kind of 8 or 9 patterns, I'm really seeing that it would be so useful to have that style sheet as a reference. All the things you kind of don't think about, like if you're saying break yarn or cut your yarn at the end of something, and you want to say that consistently across all your patterns, and just how you phrase things, how you write things up. For example, do you write out centimeters or do you put cm? How do you bracket your stitch counts across all the sizes? People vary in how they do that, but the key obviously is going to be consistency, because people will want to recognize your pattern and know, you know, they buy one pattern, they'll expect the same in the next. So that's something I'm really working on having going into next year for my own usefulness. And it also just means then that the tech editors don't have to spend time checking like a previous pattern to see what I wrote before to make sure I've been consistent. It's so excellent that they do that, and that's exactly what they're needing to be doing. But then this is obviously a me problem, but I just feel so guilty in myself that I've made them do that when it's such an obvious thing that I could have done myself. I know that they don't mind and they're doing their job, and it's a me problem that I feel guilty about doing it. But I guess I also feel like I wasted my own time there, because I could have thought about it and changed it. And if I had the style sheet, I wouldn't have done that in the first place, because I would know, okay, this is the term or the phrase or the style that I want to use in all my patterns. And kind of in line with what I just said about the maths. So it's not necessarily a style sheet, but I think in general just a checklist for myself of things to think about when you're writing up the pattern, when you're grading the pattern. So like I was saying with the socks, all the different pieces that I need to think about when I'm writing up that pattern, like how many rows did they end up doing on the heel turn? So how many stitches did they have left at that point? How long does the foot need to be? How long will the toe decreases portion be? I think I just need to write out all those little steps, because it really helped me at that initial stage of the pattern development to have the gauge swatch, knowing all these things that I need to think about when writing the pattern, when grading the pattern, and it should then lead to a much smoother process through the sample making, through the final writing, the tech editing process, and then the testing, and to have a real final product that has been great from A to B. Of course, there's going to be frogging and changing of minds in between, but I'm really hoping to set myself up for even better success going forward. And I really hope this has all helped you too. So just to summarize it all quickly, do your gauge swatch, make notes, be prepared to frog, think about all the maths, and get that style sheet. Don't be me and being messy and changing how I say things between patterns and having the tech editor be like, oh, I think you said this before, so maybe you want to consider using that in this pattern. So I hope you found this really helpful. Please give it a like and drop a comment below if you have something else that you want to share, a lesson that you've learned. I'd love to hear that too, and it'd make me feel a whole heap better. I hope that putting myself out there and confessing my mistakes has helped others feel better and will change the future for other new knitting and crochet pattern designers. I have also summarised everything that I'm going to share in this video into a blog post, so if you'd like to have it written down as well as watching this video, you can head to my website. I'll put a link in the description. I'll see you again soon for another episode of Wander and Create with Emma.